If we adjust this section here, we can increase the efficiency by at least 15%.
I remember when this house was first built.
It's the only way forward. We both know that.
There was a small ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter when my parents walked into my house with their suitcases. I want you to picture this. Not a fancy bowl. A small handmade bowl with an uneven glaze, sort of green-blue at the bottom and going to a pale yellow at the rim, that my daughter Hester had made in 7th grade pottery class 12 years ago. The bowl had been holding 3 apples that morning. The apples had been from the small tree in our backyard. Hester had been planning to bake a tart that weekend. The bowl had been sitting on the counter in the middle of our small kitchen as the late afternoon light had been coming through the window above the sink in long, pale stripes. I had been making tea when the doorbell rang. I had put the kettle on. I had taken 3 small cups out of the cabinet because my husband Ronan had been working from home in his small office down the hall, and I had been planning to bring him a cup, and because Hester had been about to come home from her job at the small architecture firm where she had been working since she had graduated. The cups had been the small hand-painted ones I had bought at a roadside pottery stand on a vacation Ronan and I had taken 8 years ago. The bowl had been Hester's. The kettle had been Ronan's grandmother's. Almost everything in my kitchen, on the afternoon the doorbell rang, had been a small object that had been quietly accumulated over 20 years of building a life that had not been the life my parents had imagined for me at 17. I had answered the door. I had been wearing an old gray cardigan and the small pair of slippers my daughter had given me for Mother's Day 3 years earlier. I had not been expecting anybody. The neighborhood we lived in was the kind of neighborhood where the doorbell did not ring much. I had walked to the front door with the small, distracted attention you give to a doorbell on a weekday afternoon. The 2 people standing on my front porch had been my parents. I had not seen them in 17 years. The last time I had seen them had been when I had been 20 years old, at the small courthouse where my custody arrangement for Hester had been finalized, where my father had walked past me without speaking, and where my mother had said, in the voice she had been using on me since I had been 17, that they had decided they were not going to be involved in the situation any further. The people on my porch had been older than the version of them I had been carrying in my head. My mother had been 71. Her hair had gone white in a way that had aged her by a decade. My father had been 73. He had lost weight. He had been holding the handle of a small wheeled suitcase. My mother had been holding the handle of a slightly larger one. The 2 of them had been wearing matching navy coats. They had been standing on my porch in the late afternoon light, with their suitcases beside them, looking like a couple who had just arrived from a long trip and who had expected to be received. My mother had spoken first. She had said, in the voice she had been using on me my whole life, "Exiled, family takes care of family. We have been thinking about this for a long time. We are sorry we have been distant. We are here now. We need somewhere to stay for a while. Can we come in?" I want you to understand. I had been 37 years old. I had been a single parent for the first 10 years of my daughter's life, and a co-parent with my husband Ronan for the last 7. I had built, in the 20 years since my parents had kicked me out of their house with a small backpack at 17, a particular kind of life that I had not been able to build by accepting the version of family they had been offering me. I had been ready, in a small, specific way that nobody in my family knew about, for the moment when they would finally arrive at my door asking for the kind of family I had been refusing to provide. The being ready had not been the kind of readiness that had assumed they would actually come. The being ready had been a quieter readiness, in which I had been building over the previous 4 years, a small, careful plan that had been designed to handle the moment if it ever happened. The plan had been in a folder. The folder had been on the small shelf above the refrigerator, where I had kept it for the previous 14 months, after the most recent update Ronan and I had made to the plan with our lawyer. I had told my parents to come in. I had not hugged them. I had not invited them to sit down in the living room. I had walked them into the kitchen, where the bowl had been on the counter and the kettle had been just starting to whistle. I had taken down a 3rd cup. I had told them to sit at the small kitchen table. I want to tell you what was in the folder, and what my mother's hands started doing when she had seen the first page, and what my father had said when I had finished explaining what the folder was. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have been waiting, for years, for somebody in their family to show up asking for what those family members had refused to provide them, and who have been quietly figuring out, in the small, careful way you figure things out when you have been doing it alone, what they would actually offer when the asking finally came. I want to tell you what I figured out. Before I do, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about the moment you stopped imagining a confrontation with somebody in your family and started imagining, instead, the careful, structured offer you would make them if they ever showed up at your door asking for the thing they had refused to give you. Tell me how long it took you to make the shift. Tell me whether you have used the offer yet. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the year I was 17, because the year is the foundation of everything else. My name is Exiled Pemberton. I am 37 years old. I run a small real estate development firm. My firm has been in operation for the last 8 years. We build small, environmentally careful housing developments in rural and semi-rural parts of New England, mostly for older adults and for people transitioning into smaller homes after their children have left. The work is the kind of work I fell into by accident, after a series of small, careful decisions I had made starting at 21, when I had used the last $700 in my savings account to put a deposit on a community college course in real estate fundamentals that I had taken at night while working 2 jobs and raising my 1-year-old daughter alone. I want to tell you about the night I was 17, because the night is the night the rest of my life started. I had been 4 months pregnant when my parents had figured out. I had been hiding it under the small, careful clothing teenagers wear when they have been hiding something. I had been planning to tell them on a Sunday afternoon, after church, in a way I had been preparing for weeks. I had been planning also to tell them in a way that did not yet include the name of the boy who had been the father, because the boy had been somebody my parents had specifically forbidden me to spend time with, and I had been figuring out how to introduce the 2 pieces of information separately. I had not gotten the chance. My mother had found a small medical bill in my school bag from a small free clinic I had been visiting in the town next to ours, where I had been getting prenatal care that I had been paying for in cash that I had been saving from a babysitting job. The bill had been small. The bill had been enough. My mother had laid the bill on the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening at 6:15. She had asked me what it was. She had asked me in the voice she had been using on me for as long as I could remember when she had been about to make a moment about herself. I had told her the truth. I had told her I was 4 months pregnant. I had told her the father had been a boy named Cassiel, who she had told me not to date, who I had been dating anyway, who had been 17, who had been black, who had been planning to go to community college the following fall, and who had been, in the small, careful months we had been together, the first person in my life who had told me that the small, careful version of me that my parents had been raising was not actually the only version of me available. My mother had not said anything for a long moment. My father had walked into the kitchen from the living room, where he had been watching a small news program. He had seen my mother's face. He had asked what was happening. My mother had told him. The 2 of them had stood at the kitchen counter for almost 2 minutes without speaking. My mother had then walked upstairs. She had come back down 10 minutes later with a small backpack she had taken out of my closet. She had been packing it as she had been walking. She had put in 3 pairs of underwear, 2 shirts, a sweater, my toothbrush, a small bottle of shampoo, a pair of pajamas, and the small framed photograph of my grandmother on my father's side that had been on my dresser. She had handed me the backpack. She had told me, in the same voice she had been using all evening, that I had decided to throw my life away, that the family had been raising me to be a particular kind of daughter, that I had refused to be that daughter, that the family was not going to pay the cost of my refusal, and that I had 30 minutes to leave the house. She had not yelled. She had been calm. She had been the kind of calm she had been my whole life when she had been doing something cruel. The calm had been a calculation. She had been making sure I would not be able to argue with her about what she had been doing, by performing the doing as if it had been an obvious and reasonable consequence of my own behavior. My father had not intervened. He had been standing in the corner of the kitchen with his hands in his pockets. He had been looking at the floor. He had been 48 years old. He had been a man who had spent 26 years of his marriage being the kind of husband who had occupied the corner of rooms while his wife had been doing whatever she had been doing. He had not, that evening, become a different kind of husband. I had picked up the backpack. I had walked out of the house. I had walked to a payphone 3 blocks down the street, which had still been in use in 2007 because our small town had been late to remove them. I had called Cassiel's mother, who was a woman named Yetunde, who had been a nurse at the regional hospital, who had not yet met me but had heard about me from her son. I had told her, in the small breaking voice I had been using on the payphone, what had happened. Yetunde had told me to wait at the payphone. She had told me she was coming. She had arrived in her small gray sedan 18 minutes later. She had been wearing her hospital scrubs. She had been 36 years old. She had not asked me any questions in the car. She had taken me to her small apartment in the town next to ours, where she had been raising Cassiel as a single mother since her own husband had died when Cassiel had been 7, and where she had been making a small, careful life on a nurse's salary in a small 2-bedroom apartment that she had been keeping clean and warm and welcoming. She had let me sleep on her couch that night. She had let me sleep on her couch for the next 6 weeks. She had then, slowly and with no announcement, converted the small storage room next to Cassiel's bedroom into a 3rd bedroom, with a small twin mattress she had bought used from a colleague, and she had moved me in. I want to tell you about Yetunde, because Yetunde had been the kind of woman my mother had not been able to imagine existing. Yetunde had been the woman who had taken in her son's pregnant teenage girlfriend without complaint, without conditions, without a single performance of inconvenience, and who had then spent the next 2.5 years quietly building the foundation of the life I had eventually been able to build for myself and my daughter. Yetunde had been the one who had told me, in the small kitchen of her apartment when I had been 7 months pregnant, that I was going to finish high school. She had enrolled me, with my permission, in the small alternative high school program our state had for pregnant teenagers, which had let me complete my coursework on a flexible schedule. She had been the one who had driven me to the hospital when my water had broken, 8 days early, on a Thursday morning in early January. She had been the one who had held my hand during the labor because Cassiel had been at school taking a final, and because she had been the only person available who had been the right kind of available. She had been the one who had told me, when Hester had been 3 days old, that I should call my daughter Hester after Yetunde's own mother in Nigeria, who had been named Esther, but who had been called Hester by the British colonial administrators when she had been a girl, and whose Hester name had been the one Yetunde had been carrying as a kind of family inheritance for 40 years. I had said yes. The name had been my way of saying thank you to the woman who had become, in the 8 months since I had been 17, the actual mother I had been needing. Cassiel and I had stayed together for 4 years. We had been good together for 2 of those years. We had been less good for the 3rd. We had been, by the 4th, 2 young people who had been trying to make a relationship work because we had a child together, and who had been figuring out, the way most young people figure out, that having a child together had not been enough to keep us together. We had broken up when I had been 21 and Cassiel had been 22. The breakup had been the kindest kind of breakup that 2 young parents can manage. He had stayed in Hester's life. He had been a careful father. He had remained close with Yetunde, who had been my closest family member for the previous 4 years. Yetunde had been clear, on the day of the breakup, that she had still been my family. She had been clear on it for the 16 years since. I want to tell you what my parents had done during those years, because the years are when the cover story started. My parents had told the extended family, 3 days after they had kicked me out, that I had run away. They had said I had been emotionally unstable. They had said they had been worried about me. They had said they had been looking for me, but that I had not wanted to be found. They had repeated this story at every family gathering for the next several years. They had repeated it at my grandmother's funeral, when I had been 18 and had not been able to attend because they had told me I would not be welcome. They had repeated it at my cousin's wedding, when I had been 19. They had repeated it at the holiday parties, at the church potlucks, at the small social gatherings of their friends. The extended family had believed them. Most of them had not been close enough to me to question the story. A few had wondered. A few had asked me, years later, when they had finally tracked me down through small Facebook searches, what had actually happened. I had told them. They had been horrified. They had been also not in a position to do much about it, because they had been people on the periphery of my parents' lives, and because my parents had built, over the years, a small, careful social ecosystem that had reinforced their version of what had happened to me. I had not pushed for correction. I had let my parents have their cover story for the first decade. The not pushing had not been forgiveness. The not pushing had been a survival decision. I had been trying to build a life. I had not had energy left over for a public correction campaign. I want to tell you what I built. I want to give you the timeline, because the timeline is the thing that mattered when my parents finally arrived at my door. I had finished high school at 18 while caring for a 4-month-old with Yetunde's help. I had enrolled in community college at 19. I had taken classes part-time for the next 3 years while working 2 jobs. I had transferred to a small state university at 22. I had graduated with a degree in business administration at 25. I had started working at a small commercial real estate office in our town in a junior role when I had been 25. I had learned the business. I had been promoted 3 times. I had left that office at 28 with $11,000 in savings and had started my own small firm. The firm had been small for the first 3 years. The firm had broken even at 31. The firm had started growing seriously when I had been 33, after I had taken on a small business partner named Atavia Halloran, who had brought her own capital and her own client base. Atavia and I had built the firm into a small, profitable, regionally respected operation. By the time I had been 37, the firm had been employing 9 people, had been managing 14 active development projects, and had been generating revenue that had allowed me to comfortably support my family without external assistance. I had married Ronan Breivik when Hester had been 10. Ronan was a structural engineer who had done consulting work for one of our early projects, who had been kind to Hester from the beginning, and who had become, over the years, the kind of stepfather Hester had eventually started calling Dad. He had been 42 now. He had been steady. He had been the man I had been needing to find and who I had eventually found when I had been ready to find him. Hester had been almost 20 by the time my parents arrived at my door. She had been working at a small architecture firm in our town after graduating from college the year before. She had been a careful, observant young woman who had grown up surrounded by Yetunde, by Cassiel, by Yetunde's extended family in our town, by Ronan, by my business partner Atavia, and by the small network of friends and colleagues I had built over the years. She had grown up in every way that mattered in a family. The family had not been the one I had been born into. The family had been the one I had built. The building had been the work of my entire adult life. I want to tell you about the 4 years before my parents had arrived at the door, because the 4 years are when I had built the folder. About 4 years earlier, when I had been 33, I had been at a small dinner with my business partner Atavia. We had been talking about the future of the firm. Atavia had been thinking about her own aging parents in Boston. She had been worried about them. She had been talking about the possibility of building, at some point, a small development that would be specifically designed for older adults who had been wanting to downsize but who had not wanted to move into traditional assisted living facilities. The development she had been imagining had been something between a small senior community and a regular residential neighborhood, with shared amenities, smaller homes, and a particular emphasis on community among the residents. I had liked the idea. We had started developing it informally over the next 2 years. By the time I had been 35, we had identified a piece of land about an hour north of our town, in a small valley near a state park, that had been suitable for the kind of development we had been imagining. We had started the planning process. We had been working through zoning approvals, environmental impact assessments, architectural designs, and the small, careful financial modeling that any real estate development of that size required. The development had been called Goldenrod. It had been designed for 24 small homes, each between 800 and 1,200 square feet, with a shared community building, a small garden, walking paths, and on-site nursing support for residents who eventually needed it. The pricing model had been designed to be reachable for older adults with moderate retirement savings, with options for both purchase and long-term lease, and with a small scholarship fund for residents who could not afford the full cost. Around the time we had been finalizing the development plan, when I had been about 35 and a half, I had been talking with Ronan one evening about my parents. I had been talking about them in the small, distant way I had been talking about them for years. Ronan had listened, the way he had listened to most of my stories about them. Then he had said, in the careful way he said things he had been thinking about for a long time, "Exiled, what are you going to do if they ever show up?" I had told him I did not know. I had told him I had been assuming for years that they would not show up. I had told him that the assumption had been based on the fact that my parents had been the kind of people who did not show up. They had been the kind of people who let estrangements continue for decades. They had been people who maintained their cover story to the grave. Ronan had nodded. He had said, "Exiled, they are going to show up. I have been watching them at a distance for 7 years. I have been watching them age. I have been watching their friends in your hometown get older, and their support network shrink, and their financial position become less stable. They are going to show up. They are going to show up when they have run out of other options. The other options are going to run out, by my estimate, sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. I want you to have a plan." I had asked him what he had thought the plan should be. He had said, "I have been thinking. I want you to consider the idea that the plan should not be a confrontation. I want you to consider the idea that the plan should be an offer. The offer should be something you can give them that is consistent with the kind of woman you have built yourself into being. The offer should not require them to apologize for the past. The offer should not require them to acknowledge what they did. The offer should simply be the offer. They can take it, they can refuse it. The structure of the offer should be designed so that the taking of it changes the long-term arrangement of who you are to each other in a way that you can live with for the rest of your life." I had been quiet for a long time. I had finally said, Ronan, I do not know what the offer would be. He had said, I think the offer is goldenrod. I had looked at him. He had said, I think the offer is a small home at Goldenrod. I think the offer is the place you have been building for older adults who have been wanting to live in a community that is not their old life. I think the offer is a place where your parents can live the rest of their lives in a small home that they own or lease, in a community that is professionally run, with on-site care available as they need it, without ever having to live in your house. The offer would mean they do not get to access you in the way they would have if they had been a different kind of family. The offer would mean they do get to be near you, in a specific structural way that is consistent with what you have built. The offer would be material. The offer would be real. The offer would be the kind of offer that, in some ways, no other developer in your area is positioned to make to them, because no other developer would know what the offer needed to do, in addition to providing housing. I had been crying quietly by the time he had finished. I had asked him whether he was sure. He had said, Exiled, I have been thinking about it for almost a year. I think it is the right offer. I think it is the offer that would let you be the kind of daughter you want to be, without requiring you to be the kind of daughter you have refused to be. I want to put it together with you, on paper, so that we have it ready if they ever come. The having of it ready is the work. The using of it, if it ever happens, will be the easy part. The work is the preparation. I want you to prepare with me. We had prepared. We had spent the next 4 months building the structure. We had worked with our lawyer, a small, careful woman named Ms. Iolanthe Worthington, who had drafted the formal proposal documents that would describe the offer. We had developed pricing. We had developed financing terms. We had developed a small set of conditions about behavior, communication, and the involvement of my parents in Hester's life that would be necessary for the offer to be activated and to remain available over time. The conditions had not been punitive. The conditions had been structural. The conditions had been designed to make sure that the offer, if my parents accepted it, would result in a relationship that was sustainable for everybody involved. We had finalized the folder when I had been 36. We had put it on the small shelf above the refrigerator. We had updated it once, 14 months before my parents had arrived, when one of the underlying terms of the Goldenrod project had changed. The folder had been ready for almost a year and a half when the doorbell had rung. I want to tell you what happened in my kitchen during the next 45 minutes. I had made the tea. I had given each of my parents a cup. I had sat down across from them at the small kitchen table. I had taken the folder down from the shelf above the refrigerator. I had set it on the table between us. I had not opened it yet. I had said, in the careful voice I had been practicing for 4 years, Mom, Dad, I have been waiting for this moment for a long time. I want to tell you what I have been doing while I have been waiting. I want to tell you because the doing is the only thing that matters now. The past is not going to be discussed at this table today. The past is something we are going to have to work through over the course of years if you choose to take what I am about to offer you. The offer is in this folder. I am going to walk you through it carefully. I am going to ask you to listen all the way through before you respond. I am going to ask you to take the folder home with you after we have finished talking, and to take 7 days to think about it before you give me an answer. I am not going to be available for emotional conversations during those 7 days. I will be available, however, to answer specific factual questions. Mom, please put down your cup. Dad, please look at me. They had done what I had asked. I had opened the folder. I want to tell you what was in the folder, page by page, because the pages are the thing my mother's hands started trembling over, and the trembling was the moment I had been preparing for, in a different way than I had imagined it. The first page had been a small introductory letter from Ms. Worthington, on her law firm's letterhead, that had described the contents of the folder as a structured offer of housing assistance, prepared by her client Isolt Pemberton, to be evaluated by the recipients within 7 days of receipt. The second page had been a small executive summary of the Goldenrod development. The summary had described the location, the type of housing, the community, the on-site services, the pricing structure, and the timeline. The development had been scheduled to open in the spring of the following year. Construction had been underway. The first phase of homes had already been receiving applications. The third page had been a small offer letter. The letter had said, in clean professional language, that I was offering to provide my parents with a long-term lease on one of the small one-bedroom homes at Goldenrod, at a rental rate set at 15% below market, for the duration of their lives, with the lease being transferable to a surviving spouse upon the death of either parent. The lease would include access to all community amenities, on-site nursing support, and the various other services that came with residency at Goldenrod. My mother had been reading the third page when her hands had started trembling. I want you to picture this. She had been holding the page with both hands. The page had started to shake, very slightly in her grip. The shaking had not been because she had been moved by the offer. The shaking had been because she had been processing, in real time, that the offer was real, that the offer was substantial, that the offer was the kind of offer that could only have been made by somebody with resources she had not known I had, and that the offer was structured in a way that did not allow her to either reject it as a humiliation or accept it as a vindication. The fourth page had been the conditions sheet. The conditions had been the part I had been the most careful about. The conditions had not required my parents to apologize. The conditions had not required them to acknowledge the past. The conditions had instead been the following. The first condition had been that my parents would correct the cover story they had been telling the extended family for 20 years. They would not be required to apologize publicly. They would only be required to send a small letter, drafted by Ms. Worthington and reviewed by them for accuracy, to a list of extended family members, that would state the simple, factual correction that I had not run away when I had been 17, but had been asked to leave the family home, and that we had been estranged in the years since, and that we had now reached a point in our adult lives where we had begun the work of repair. The letter had not required them to acknowledge fault. The letter had only required them to acknowledge the basic factual situation. The second condition had been that my parents would attend monthly family counseling sessions, with a counselor whose name was specified in the folder, for a period of at least 18 months, at my expense. The counseling would include Ronan, Hester, and Cassiel, who had agreed to participate. The counseling would not include Yetunde, because Yetunde had decided, when I had told her about the plan 3 years earlier, that she had been clear about who I was in her life and did not need to be part of any reconstruction of who I had been in my parents' life. I had honored her decision. The third condition had been that my parents would, before moving into Goldenrod, spend 2 weekends at our house in a structured visiting arrangement that Ronan and Hester had agreed to. The visits would be short. The visits would be designed to begin the process of having my parents and Hester actually know each other as adults, with my full involvement. The visits would not happen until my parents had agreed to the other conditions. The visits had been the most concrete proof that I was offering a real relationship and not a charity. The fourth condition had been that the offer was a one-time offer. They had to take it or refuse it within 7 days. If they refused it, the offer would not be extended again. If they accepted it, the conditions would be permanent. Violation of the conditions, after acceptance, would result in the termination of the lease. My mother had read all 4 pages by the time I had finished walking her through them. She had been crying quietly by the time she had reached the conditions sheet. My father had been reading along with her. He had not said anything during the walkthrough. When I had finished, I had told them to take the folder home with them. I had told them they had 7 days. I had told them if they had any factual questions during the 7 days, they should call Ms. Worthington's office. I had given them her card. My mother had said, in a voice that had been small in a way her voice had not been small in my whole life, "Exiled, why? Why are you offering this?" I had told her the truth. I had told her I was offering it because I had spent 20 years building the kind of woman who would be capable of offering it. I had told her the offer was not a gift to her. The offer was a gift to the version of me who had been 17 at a payphone in our hometown 20 years ago, who had been afraid she would not survive what had happened to her. The offer was a way of telling that 17-year-old version of me that she had survived, that she had built, that she had been capable of what she had been capable of, and that she had been able to offer her own parents, at 37, the kind of structured care they had refused to offer her at 17. The offer was for me as much as it was for them. The offer was for the small version of myself I had been carrying for 20 years. My father had been crying by then. He had not been able to look at me. He had said, in his small voice, "Exiled, I want you to know I have been ashamed of myself for 20 years. I have not known how to say it. I have been sitting in a corner of a kitchen for 20 years. I am sorry. I am too old to be sitting in corners anymore." I had told him I would think about what he said. I had told him my mother had 7 days. I had told them I needed them to leave my house now. I had walked them to the front door. I had not hugged either of them. I had closed the door behind them. I had walked back to the kitchen. The bowl had still been on the counter. The 3 cups had been on the table. Ronan had come out of his office. He had hugged me for a long time. I had cried into his shoulder for almost half an hour. I want to tell you what has happened in the 4 months since, because the 4 months are the part of the story I am still in. My mother had called Ms. Worthington on the 6th day of the 7. She had asked specific factual questions about the conditions. The questions had been the questions of a woman who had been thinking seriously about accepting the offer. She had called me on the 7th day. She had said yes. The letter to the extended family had gone out 2 weeks later. The letter had been brief. The letter had said exactly what Ms. Worthington had drafted. A few of the extended family members had reached out to me in small, careful ways after receiving the letter. A few of them had apologized. A few of them had been confused. A few of them had not responded at all. I had received each of the responses without performing any feelings about them. The counseling sessions had started a month after that. The sessions had been hard. The sessions had been useful. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Inez Magnuson, had been firm with my parents about the work they had been doing. She had not let them perform. She had not let my mother run her usual scripts. She had not let my father retreat into his usual silence. She had been the kind of counselor who had seen my mother's pattern before, and who had been ready for it. The 2 visits to our house had happened. The first one had been awkward. The second one had been less awkward. Hester had not warmed to my parents quickly. She had been polite. She had been distant. She had told me after the second visit that she had not been sure she was ready to call them anything yet. I had told her she did not have to call them anything. I had told her she could take her time. My parents had moved into Goldenrod 3 weeks ago. Their unit had been ready earlier than expected. They had been adjusting to the community. My mother had been participating in a small book club. My father had been helping with a small woodworking project in the community workshop. They had been, in the careful, early way new residents settle into senior communities, settling in. I had been visiting them once a month. The visits had been short. The visits had not been intimate. The visits had been, however, real. The visits had been the kind of contact that had not been possible before the folder. The folder had made the contact possible by structuring it. The structure had been the gift. The contact had been the byproduct of the gift. The 2 of them together had been what had finally let us be in a relationship that I could live with for the rest of my life. I want to tell you what I have learned because I have been thinking about it for 4 months, and I want to give you the lessons carefully. The first thing I have learned is that the people in your family who hurt you the most when you were young are not always the people you should be planning to confront when you are older. The confrontation is usually what we imagine as the resolution. The confrontation has the satisfying shape of a story. The confrontation is also, in most cases, useless. The people who hurt you when you were young are usually people who have been doing the same pattern for decades, with other people, in other situations, and who are not going to be reformed by a single conversation in which you finally tell them what they did. The confrontation will feel good for an afternoon. The confrontation will not change anything. The confrontation will also, in most cases, leave you with a kind of post-confrontation emptiness that will be worse than the original wound, because you will have expended the energy of the confrontation and will have nothing material to show for it. The structured offer is the better path. The structured offer has none of the satisfying drama of a confrontation. The structured offer has, instead, the patient material reality of an alternative arrangement that you have built, over years, using the resources you have accumulated as an adult who survived what you survived as a child. The structured offer is real. The structured offer is durable. The structured offer is what will change the rest of your life. The confrontation will only change one afternoon. The second thing I have learned is that the people who have hurt you are not always going to apologize in the way you imagined. My mother has not, in the 4 months since she moved into Goldenrod, apologized to me in any formal way. She has not given me the speech I had been quietly imagining she might give. She has not laid out, in clear language, the specific things she did when I was 17. She has not asked for forgiveness. She has, instead, been a different kind of mother to me in small, daily, observable ways. She has called me on Sundays to ask how my week has been. She has remembered details I have told her about Hester. She has sent me twice now small handwritten notes in the mail that have been about things she has been noticing about her own behavior in the counseling sessions. The notes have not been apologies in the formal sense. The notes have been, instead, the small, careful work of a woman who is figuring out, at 71, that she has been a particular kind of mother for 40 years, and that she is going to spend the rest of her life trying to be a different kind of mother. The work is real. The work is slow. The work is, however, more substantial than any formal apology she could have given me at the kitchen table 4 months ago. Most real apologies, I think now, are not events. Most real apologies are slow patterns of behavior that look, from the outside, nothing like apology, but that look, from the inside, exactly like the work of being a different person than you used to be. If you have been waiting for a formal apology from somebody, please consider that the apology may be happening already, in a form you have not been recognizing as apology, because you have been expecting the wrong shape. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you tonight, is that the family you build during the years your original family was missing is the family that makes the structured offer possible. Yetunde took me in at 17. Yetunde fed me. Yetunde drove me to my prenatal appointments. Yetunde held my hand during my labor. Yetunde named my daughter. Yetunde was the foundation of every subsequent piece of the life I built. The life I built was what made it possible, 20 years later, for me to make my parents the offer I made. Without Yetunde, I would have been a different person at 37. I would have been a person who had less. I would have been a person who, when my parents arrived at my door with their suitcases, would have had to either turn them away with anger or take them in with resentment. Yetunde gave me a third option. The third option was the option to make the structured offer. The structured offer was only possible because I had the resources to make it. The resources had been the resources of a life that had been built on top of the foundation Yetunde had given me. The foundation is the gift. The structured offer is what the foundation makes possible later. If you are at the start of your life and your original family has not given you a foundation, please consider that the foundation does not have to come from them. The foundation can come from somebody else. The somebody else is usually a person you would not have predicted. The somebody else might be a friend's mother. The somebody else might be an older neighbor. The somebody else might be a coworker, a teacher, a stranger who picks you up at a payphone in your hometown at 17. The somebody else will not look like your original family. The somebody else will, however, become your actual family. The actual family is the family that makes everything else possible. Please find them. They are out there. They have been waiting to find you too. The finding is mutual. The finding is the whole point. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me in the comments about the somebody else in your life who became your actual family during the years your original family was missing. Tell me how you met them. Tell me what they gave you. Tell me whether you have thanked them in plain language for what they made possible. Tell me whether you have built, on the foundation they gave you, the kind of life that has eventually allowed you to make structured offers to other people. Tell me what those offers have looked like. There are more of us than the original families who turned us away would ever guess. We have been raising each other quietly, for decades, in small apartments and on couches and at kitchen tables, and the raising has been the foundation of an entire alternative family system that exists alongside the system that turned us away. The alternative system is real. The alternative system is, in many cases, the only system that worked. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.